Welcome to Where Parents Talk. My name is Lianne Castelino. Our guest today is a leading Canadian sociologist. She is a distinguished university professor at Memorial University in Newfoundland, a researcher, and a member of the Order of Canada. Dr. Barbara Neis is also a mother of two and a grandmother. She is an author as well. She's one of the editors of a new book called Families, Mobility, and Work, published in the fall of 2022. Dr. Neis joins us today from St. John's. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the invitation, Lianne. It's lovely to be here.
So, Families, Mobility, and Work is the name of the book. It is a culmination of more than a decade's worth of research. What was the catalyst that led to the creation of this book?
Well, the book is the product of something we call the On the Move Partnership, which was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council more than 10 years ago. And the catalyst for that project was initially work we were doing in rural Newfoundland in fishing communities, where we discovered that in many of the communities, a lot of the adults were missing, particularly the men. And we were trying to work with communities around helping them rebuild their economies after the collapse of the cod stocks. And we realized that we had very little information on who was away, where they were. It was very hard to get statistical information, and lots of rumors and suggestions about what was going on and how it was affecting those communities and the families in the communities, but there really wasn't any research on that. So that was the beginning. But then as we developed the project and started to look more broadly at extended mobility for work or complex mobility for work, we realized that it's not just fly in, fly out, or drive in, drive out workers who are affected by this. There's many, many different kinds of workers who are dealing with complex extended mobilities for work. And there really hadn't been a comprehensive study on that. So it became a national study operating in 7 provinces with many co-investigators across many universities and international collaborators as well, and partners like the Vanier Institute, the family. And so, and in the process of that, we started looking not just at people who were, again, traveling long distances for work, but they might not be going very far, but they had complex extended mobility, such as home care workers, for example, who might have to take public transit, would get up in the morning, would take their child to school, and then would go to their first home where they would work, and then they would have downtime, and they'd hang out in Tim Hortons and so on, and then they would go to their second placement, and those placements would change, and they might be away from home for, say, 15 or 16 hours or 10 hours or 12, but paid for only 5 or 6 of those hours. Or truck drivers or seafarers, or there's so many people, construction workers in Canada, for whom mobility is a kind of core central part of what they are grappling with as they try to combine finding work and completing that work and a family life at home.
Speaking of that family life, I'm curious as to what struck you most as you sort of looked at, conducted, and then compiled this research as it relates specifically to your findings around families and work mobility.
So, I think, it's interesting because early on we did a paper. I was just looking at that this morning. Chrissy Vincent and I did a review paper that looked at basically the potential relationship between work scheduling and parenting, particularly child educational achievement. And what we saw in that literature was that a whole range of things might impact child educational achievement that are also linked to work and mobility. So, for example, just physical presence, right? So child educational achievements might be stronger if the parents are involved in their education. But if the parents are not physically available to be involved, that's a potential threat to that relationship and to that success. And similarly, if they're not available or they're stressed out, or you've got what we call fragile synchronicity. So the work scheduling and the child scheduling just don't mesh particularly well. Then that's stressful, and so and there may be also issues with affective availability. So the emotional availability of a parent and potential. So we kind of started there, but I think that when you start to look at all these different relationships, different kinds of mobility and the consequences, there are a whole bunch of things that come with not just the time bind that comes from, say, a 2-hour commute in Toronto or in Newfoundland, where you lived in St. John's and had a 2-hour drive out to a construction work site. But also the spatial issue of just not being in the same place. Too often we assume that people get up in the morning and they go a short distance to work, and it's always the same workplace. There's only one workplace, and there's stability there. And all of our thinking around children and parenting and all of these things takes that for granted. But there's a huge proportion of the population for which that's just not the case. Precarious employment is so widespread now, particularly in places like Ontario, but elsewhere as well. So you don't know where you're going to be going to go to work. So you can't move close to your workplace, because maybe it's not in the same place anymore, or it's only a short term, or you're doing 3 jobs and it's taking you in different directions. So there are all of these things that we really need to think about in terms of how they might impact families.
Along those lines, as you note, there are so many aspects to what impacts family life today, over and beyond what your area of study. But I'm curious, what do you see as some of the opportunities here? You've outlined some of the impacts, but and the challenges, but what are some of the opportunities that we should be paying attention to?
Are you talking about opportunities that come from mobility, or are you talking about opportunities for intervention?
Both.
Okay. Okay, so opportunities that come from mobility. Well, again, I live in a region of Canada, where we've had historically very high unemployment, particularly in rural areas. And so mobility for work has provided an opportunity often for at least some rural workers to find good sources of income. If you think, for example, of seafarers, right? So a seafarer might be away from home for 6 weeks at a time. It's a long rotation often. And then they're home, or they're working on offshore oil and gas platforms, or or maybe they're working in Alberta, or they're truck driving. But the mobility gives them access to income and potentially job security that they couldn't get if they stayed in their community. It also allows them to stay in their community. That's the other thing. We've talked to families who moved back from Alberta to, say, live in Newfoundland and opted for extended rotations, because it allowed them to live close to family. It gave them the opportunity, if you like, to have the supports that come from that, and also to have a particular kind of lifestyle that they preferred, which was rural, and access to a whole range of activities and so on and so forth. So there's no question that there are opportunities in certain kinds of mobility, but the flip side of that is that, mobility is costly, increasingly costly. If the employer is managing the costs of that and the arrangements of getting to and fro, if the rotation is reasonable, say 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off, you can get a lot of downtime with your family and compensate for the other time when you're away. But if it's 6 weeks away and a week home, right, or all winter or whatever, then we're into a very different kind of situation. And again, it doesn't have to be long distances. Stephanie Premji's research in Toronto with recent immigrants really highlighted, the challenges that the combination of racism and poverty that meant that they often were living in fairly remote parts of the city that were poorly served by public transit. And they were working in precarious employment, often in the downtown. They had to get from one place to the other. They're working family unfriendly hours, say night shift as cleaners or whatever, when the public transit is often also not great. So the opportunities there, I think, or the first opportunity is let's take mobility seriously, right? We can't assume, if the COVID is a classic example of this, right? I think there was a kind of assumption that, and the main strategy for controlling COVID was to tell people to go home and stay home. The only way we could do that was if other people went to work, right? And then all of a sudden, there's a discovery, well, that you've got, again, poorly paid, often immigrant workers relying on public transit, who have to, and they're poorly served by public transit, but we need them to go to work. And then they're going into work environments where they're not well protected. And then you have issues of outbreaks and poorly served communities in terms of COVID supports. So it's COVID in a way. In Newfoundland, we discovered, in a sense, that we had thousands of interprovincial rotational workers. And we had a problem because we didn't want people to come into the province to control COVID. And so then how do you manage them? They have to still go to work. They're essential workers. The work has to be done. Truckers would be another good example. How do we manage them coming and going, and the public fear and other fears around disease exposure? So the point is, the opportunity is to say work-related mobility is widespread. We're looking at about 16% of the Canadian labor force that's engaged in some kind of extended complex mobility for work. That's huge, right? While we're dealing with labor shortages, while we're dealing with many issues in the wider economy. So the question then is, what now that we're paying attention to this, if we're paying attention, and we did during COVID, I'm not sure we are anymore, although there is all this discussion around people who want to work from home, right? But again, not everybody can work from home. Let's be clear. Only some people can work from home. So let's pay attention to the ones who have to be mobile, understand the conditions of mobility, and then start to think, what types of policy changes do we need to improve their capacity to both work and parent and have family and community lives?
It is such a complex topic when you spell it out that way. But I want to go back a bit before getting into the policy piece of it. The 2021 census data in Canada show that multi-generational households are the fastest growing census family household type in this country in recent decades. Multi-generational households, of course, pertain to households with 3 or more generations. What has been the greatest impact of this trend, as has been noted in your research?
Well, I think I'm assuming what you're talking about is the sections where we talk about grandparenting.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah, so that's work that's been done mostly out of Prince Edward Island and Cape Breton by Christina Murray and her team. And she's working with community organizations where basically grandparents who have ended up raising their grandchildren and caring for them have begun to mobilize and to try to deal with all of the challenges that they experience. And the link there to mobility is that, again, if we have essentially family unfriendly and worker unfriendly policies related to work scheduling, encompassing also work mobility, that puts stresses and strains on families, right? And so, part of the On the Move project documented some of these real issues with mental health issues for example, in work camps. The isolation of women living in rural areas whose partners are absent, but who may not feel that they can actually publicly engage in their community without triggering gossip and so on and so forth, right? So you have all of these tensions, and you have mobile children who, there are issues potentially with drugs and so on. You're moving from one environment to another, and then you're coming back again, and you may be coming back with drug-related addictions and so on. So when you put all this together, one of the things that you could end up with is parents who basically don't have the capacity, in a sense, to raise their own children, or who are gone for work, and they're in order for them to go, the grandparents have to take over, but then may have to keep taking over and ultimately take responsibility. So it's how that responsibility for grandparents can create opportunities for them to be close to those grandchildren, to grow up with them, to have them nearby as opposed to, say, far away, but also some of the challenges for them, and they can be in terms of legal recognition of their responsibility, state support of their responsibility for those children, the ability to be elderly and have the type of life they thought they might have when they retired, as opposed to the life that they end up with. So this is a complex field, and there's some very interesting and important work, I think, happening around this in Prince Edward Island and some other places.
Is there anything in particular with respect to what you just described as it relates to grandparents, in many cases being responsible for raising their grandchildren on their own independently, that surprised you in terms of the findings of that research?
Well, again, that's not my research, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Christina is one of the co-editors of this book, and I know Nora Spinks has been working with her as well on this. But I guess from my point of view, I noticed it recently in a CBC story. There was another case where they were talking about, this was an Indigenous grandparent who was talking about, well, if I'm taking care of a child under one situation, I'm entitled to this kind of state support. If they are foster children, if I'm a foster parent and I'm taking care of a child, I get far more support. And then if I actually adopt them, I don't get hardly any state support, right? So there's it's like and this is I know I was communicating with Christina this morning about that case. And she said, this is the type of issue that the grandparents movement in Prince Edward Island is really trying to address. That if there's an expectation and a desire on their part to take responsibility where the parents cannot do that, and this may be work-related mobility, it could be any number of things, then what types of programming and supports do we need to have in place to make that work for the grandparent, the grandchildren, and ultimately for the parents as well?
So along those lines, what kind of policy changes do you believe need to be looked at, first of all, in the short term, and why is that?
Well, I think, again, from a policy point of view, we have to look at, and I don't think we've done enough of this, we have to think about precarious employment. There's more and more employment is precarious. We don't have job security. And we also, the housing market in some parts of the country is really out of control, particularly for lower income earners, right? So we've got this real dilemma, and in a sense, everybody's losing, right? We've got labor shortages on the one hand, we've got people who are struggling to, in a sense, spatially match their access to work and their ability to live and to have a place where they can have a family and so on and so forth. All right. So the question is, how can we fix these things? And I think, some of the responsibility goes to employers, but also to government in terms of employment standards. I mean, what are we doing, in a sense, to to require employers to be accommodating, to meet the needs in work scheduling, to accommodate to the needs of families, including the challenges of mobility, right? Because again, you're away from your family, not simply, let's say you're offered a 4-hour shift here and a 2-hour shift there and a 3-hour shift there, and you're trying to patch all this together. And the hours are family unfriendly and so on. There's so much, I think, that we need to talk about there. And I think the same is true for, say, fly in, fly out workers. There's a chapter in the book where Kara Arnold and Nora Spinks tried to survey fly in, fly out companies, right, who are bringing in and out workers from long distances. And about what they do in their policies and practices in their companies to accommodate the needs of those workers from a family point of view. And there was very little, right? So, and most of what's offered is basically, an employee assistance program, which is essentially when things go wrong, right? When your marriage starts to fall apart, or you've got a problem with your children or whatever, then you can go to a counselor, you can do this. But there's very little indication that there is any sense on the part of employers that in scheduling, they need to proactively anticipate potential consequences and try to accommodate the complex needs of families and migration and so on in their work scheduling. And it's not, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I can remember I was on a plane talking to a rotational worker who was flying to Alberta, and he had a spouse at home who was unwell. She had a chronic health problem. He was a Red Seal tradesperson. And, he was talking about his work scheduling and how his employer had overnight decided to change the work schedule so that it went from, I think, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, or 3 on, 3 off, to 1 on, 1 off, which is impossible. If you live in Newfoundland, 2 days out of that 1 week are going to be spent in travel if you're lucky. And these days that would be very lucky. Given air transport. And he basically, because he was a Red Seal tradesperson and highly valued, that day he changed jobs. But there are so many workers who don't have that option.
It's such an interesting area of research, I have to say. And you talked about COVID-19 and the global pandemic, and I wonder what has been the impact of this global pandemic on this topic of families and work-related mobility in terms of, has it exacerbated the situation? Has it elevated the importance of having this, societal dialogue on this topic in a way that you think is positive?
Well, when COVID-19 started, we pretty immediately started thinking, well, we have to start monitoring this and monitoring its impact on the mobile workers that we've been studying now for almost a decade. And it was really, really striking. And again, it went right across the board from your urban, again, worker who is, say, employed at, in a big warehouse in some part of Toronto and has to get there by public transit, and all of the complexities around potential exposures at home and in the community, potential exposures on the road, potential exposures in the workplace for them, and right across the board, right? And so it just raised all kinds of issues, I think. So that if you have to quarantine for 2 weeks at home, before you're allowed to see your family and go out in the community, if you come back into Newfoundland, which was the situation, right, for some of these rotational workers, and you're on a, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off rotation, there's no point in going home. And let's say you have a bit longer, you still have this incredibly poignant situation where someone is living in a tent or in, their garage, they've been away, they want to be with their families, and they can't be with them, and they weren't allowed to go out in the community, and and so on and so forth, right? So that's just one example. Seafarers, seafarers, people worked in the cruise ship industry, who worked on ships. They were stuck on those ships, right? They couldn't get off those ships, and they were at high risk of infection, particularly on cruise ships. I mean, you had some of the worst outbreaks there, but they could end up at sea for months and months at a time because there was nobody to relieve them. Their contracts were extended. It was too complex, too expensive to move them around. So those are just two examples. Plus your urban worker. So I think that what COVID did, I mean, it was just, it made us realize, or it made us realize, if they didn't go to work, if there weren't seafarers, there was nothing, there weren't products, right? If there weren't delivery people who brought your packages because you wanted to stay home, and were expected to stay home, if they weren't there and they weren't going from place to place to place and putting themselves at risk, taxi drivers and so on, then how could we even function? They're so crucial, ultimately so crucial, and yet so many of them, their lives are so invisible. They're poorly paid. They're poorly, they have lack of job security, and there was really not a lot there in terms of protection for them. Temporary foreign workers, another perfect example that we touch on in the book, but that we've looked at more closely in the larger project. Right, very, very heavily impacted by COVID, both in terms of employment, just getting here, but then when they were here, in terms of outbreaks. And all of what happened was not a surprise in terms of the potentials to the researchers who'd been working with those temporary foreign workers. They knew the housing conditions, they knew the work conditions, and basically it was just, that's what put them at risk.
Dr. Neis, what would you like readers of Families, Mobility, and Work to take away from this book?
Well, again, let's say the first thing I would say is let's just stop operating with models that people get up in the morning, take care of their kids, get them off to school, and then walk down the street or drive down the street or take the bus or bike and go to their place of work, and the place of work is fixed, and the mobility isn't a problem, right? It's a challenge. It's not the same challenge for everyone. When we hear that people who got to work from home during COVID don't want to go back to the office, I think we have to say, what does this tell us? But we have to not stop there, right? We have to say, well, but what about all of, so what is so attractive about being able to work from home? Because there are lots of downsides. We know that in terms of working from home, particularly, I think, for women often. But there are lots of people for whom that's always going to be impossible. You're plumbers, right? All of the people we need to keep the system going, or a lot of them. It's just not going to be feasible. So then we have to say, well, if they have to be mobile and we don't like mobility, we don't want to be mobile, then we have to say, okay, so what do we need to do, I think, as a society, to make this work and to make sure that it works effectively? And that's everything, I think, from employer policies through labor standards, through public health requirements, through housing issues. It's right across the board, transportation and so on. And we just have to be more aware that there was an excellent review that was done by Hughes and Silver as part of On the Move that looked at work family literature, and the focus in that on time bind. But again, that literature for the most part has focused on a narrow, tight range of occupations and it has not taken mobility into account, right? The assumption is it's not a problem. But the reason why we get away with that, I think, is partly because somebody's quietly doing the work of trying to make this work, right? We call it fragile synchronicities. Somebody's got to make all the different patterns of work and school and so on, and travel between them, and family lives of all of these different people in this household. Somebody's got to make it come together and somehow or other, keep it going, and it's the families themselves. I think often the women, the grandparents, whoever's available, are stepping up to make that work, but it can be very, very, very challenging. And I think we haven't done enough to identify how challenging that is, and to identify ways to help mediate that and to support them, because it's not going away, right? Maybe will go away for some people, but I don't think it's going away for a lot of others.
Dr. Barbara Neis, leading Canadian sociologist, Distinguished University Sociology Professor at the Memorial University in Newfoundland, and editor of Families, Mobility, and Work. We so appreciate your time and your perspective today. Thank you.
Thank you.